we have, as you see, a great panel from all parts of the industry. We have, on my right, John Chow, who is Assistant Chief Counsel. You have litigation, right, John, at Disney? Kind of. You're very involved with litigation at Disney. John Pint, who is the Senior Vice President at Access Advance Patent Pool. We have Shane next to John, who is the Director and Associate GC at Meta. And of course, we have Craig Bentley, is that Head of Video Services and Licensing at InterDigital. So this is a very interesting panel because we have all different parts of the industry that is involved in what I call the next generation of what used to be smartphone wars, but now it's the streaming wars, and there are many differences which we are going to unpack. So I'm happy because now in this panel, I get to wear my economist expert witness hat because I'm the only economist on this panel. So sometimes I will take advantage of being the moderator and interject with some economics. But let's just first start with the overarching question for all of us to center ourselves. Why is it that we are talking about this today and we are talking about this now? There's this massive shift in how media is consumed and how streaming is growing. And suddenly we see this licensing and litigation activity around streaming explode. Now, not 5 years ago, not 3 years ago, but why is now the moment? There are a couple of reasons, I think, and I would like to hear from you. I've written a couple of papers on this at the ABA with some of my co-authors in the room here, and at Antitrust Source, which really looks at the data for how fast streaming is growing, number one, and second, how the patent landscape and licensing landscape has evolved. But you're in the trenches, so I'll start with maybe you, Clay, and then you, John, to give us a sense of what you're seeing, and then we'll go to you, John, which is the streaming story.
Sure. First of all, is this on? Can you guys hear me? No? No? Yeah. There we go. First of all, thank you for having me on. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm trying to say something different than I said 2 days ago. A little bit of overlap there, and hopefully we can take a different direction. I don't see, first of all, sort of from a broader perspective, I've done licensing and opened up markets both geographically in Korea, Taiwan, China, India, and then in different technology and other markets. And there's always sort of the same pattern. The first time you go in, the response is, what are you talking about? What are patents? And then second stage is, okay, we understand patents, we understand how they apply. Third stage is getting to agreement on the value and understanding them being a consumer of patents. And finally, those market participants become huge filers of patents and move to the other side. And I think right now we're sort of in between the second and third stage, just like we were in cellular, where we were in CE, where we were in other forms of video distribution, like cable and satellite, a dozen years ago. So I don't think this is anything new. Why now versus 5 years ago, I think is, you're seeing it now because the discussions have now reached a public phase of litigation and other things that are not individual discussions between two companies. I've been licensing in the streaming space since it first started in 2009. Different companies were in that. First of all, something called TV Everywhere, and then eventually into the OTT and SVOD space. So it's there, and a lot of the licensors have patterns of talking to people for years, and only when we reach an impasse or we feel like a third party, like a court or an arbitration panel, can help resolve an impasse do we get there. And I think that's what you're seeing now, is the surfacing of things that have been going on.
Okay, so basically, basically what you're saying is, well, we've been at this since 5 years ago. We've been trying to license, and now this is hitting the courts. Actually, do you mind, John, if I change the order a little bit? Because it's only fair that John, our other John on the panel, goes next and talks about how you see this from a streaming perspective.
Sure, so obviously Disney Plus is only released in 2019, at the end of 2019, so we still view ourselves as somewhat nascent. We posted our first fiscal year of profits last year, and so, kind of trying to look at this perspective, looking at what's happened in cellular, what's happened in Wi-Fi. We've seen a lot of these industries go through a progression over decades. From our perspective, at least, we're in the very beginnings. There are a number of external factors that have kind of changed. Obviously, foreign litigations, injunctive relief has kind of changed the landscape, and perhaps, I fear, condensed the timeline, because there's a great deal of leverage with patent owners.
And let me ask you, like, the streaming market itself is growing at a double-digit rate every year in terms of revenues.
I think that's correct.
So it's a growing business.
It's absolutely
an important factor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll turn to John, and Shane, we're coming next to you. So John, you're at Access Advanced, you're at Patent Pool. You see both sides of this, licensors, licensees. From just sitting outside looking at the data, I'm seeing that the number of patents have gone up from H.264 to 265 to 266 generations of video codecs. But I've also seen that the licensing landscape has changed, right? Like back in the day, we only had the MPEG-LA pool, one pool, clear, one-stop shop, well-defined, and now we have Syswell and Avanci and Access Advanced and Real Licensing and InterDigital and Nokia and others licensing individually as well. So the landscape is far more complex. How do you see that changing the litigation environment?
Yeah, I mean, so patent pools, I think, are fundamentally a market-based response to risk clearance. And I think when you talk about MPEG-LA being the one-stop shop, I think there was a feeling 10, 12 years ago that the royalty rates for HEVC didn't adequately capture the value of the codec, both to devices and to others in the ecosystem. And so, as a result of that, a number of licensors thought that a different model that more adequately balanced the value between implementers and patent owners was appropriate. And so that's why the HEVC Advanced Pool started then. I joined the company close to 6 years ago, around the time that the BBC codec was being finalized. And one of the things we heard from the market was, we don't like fragmentation. We'd like to have early and clear clarity around what royalty rates are going to look like. So there was an outfit called NCIF that tried to undertake a pool fostering effort to try to get coalescence around what is the adequate balance of value. So we spent a lot of time listening, doing a lot of listening at that time to try to figure out what it would look like for BBC devices. Now, some people said you were too early with that. You actually maybe inhibited development of the BBC codec because you had the rates out there even before there were devices. But at the same time, the market was telling us what we want is clarity, and so that's what the pool tried to provide. Now, sort of layered on with that backdrop, in addition to sort of sequential versions of ITU standards, you're right, the AV1 and AP9 standards became competitive codecs. And there was the allegation that they were royalty-free. I don't think that that's true or even widely believed, but that was a marketing point behind those codecs. And so with respect to our streaming pool, which was more recently launched, again, it was formed, I would say, largely in response to feedback that we received from the market. At the time I joined, I don't think there was an intention to do a streaming pool, but the market came to us and said, we like what you've done, we think that you have achieved an adequate balance for devices, would you be interested in doing something similar for streaming? And so we were somewhat in reactive mode in putting the pool together. We spent maybe a year on a listening tour, talking to stakeholders, potential licensees, potential licensors, talking to economists about what would the market bear, what would be fair. And a lot of that is built into the design of the pool, where it really provides a lot of flexibility to a company that's not a streaming business to choose the codecs that they want to use based on their business reasons, rather than a perception about what the royalty rates are going to be for this codec or that codec. And from that perspective, it puts them all the codecs on equal terms. And that was I distinctly remember having a conversation with a large company saying, let the business decide. We don't, we pay for codecs, but the business people don't want to be inhibited in terms of their product design, in terms of their distribution. So can you come up with something that addresses that concern and doesn't, create an impediment?
And John, why are there multiple pools for this as opposed to the past?
So I think part of that is the market sort of coalescing around what is the appropriate value to collect for streaming activities. I think there's still to some extent a what's the right allocation of surplus as between implementers and patent holders. We think, based on what we've heard, based on the fact that we've got 7 published licensees, that we're probably pretty close. If the market has spoken, we think that's usually a pretty good signal that you're doing something potentially right. Is there more work to do? I think there's always more work to do. So when you talk about why is there litigation, again, we took a lot of effort, like I said, and based on a lot of experience within the company to design a program that we thought would have sort of immediate success and try to become the de facto way of licensing streaming early on. But in that environment, there's still people that, for strategic reasons, may want to wait, see if litigation comes out even more in their favor. Sometimes I think they discount the risk that might go the opposite direction. You're always considering maybe there'll be a lower rate that a court sets, but nobody ever considers that maybe a higher rate will be found to be friend. But frankly, the way I look at litigation is it's a tool. It's in some ways a really inefficient tool, and it's one that you want to only consider as a last resort. But sometimes there are companies that only respond to sort of that, not threat, but that sort of reality of, we can no longer avoid the conversation because, it's now presented itself to us. I mean, look, I think I'm a nice guy. I try to ask nicely. I try to answer questions and explain the benefits of the program. But if somebody isn't ready yet, there's not a lot that I can do to make them ready other than continue to point out, what their competitors are doing and other people that are coming on, as licensees.
Okay, I'm gonna move to Shane for your perspective, Shane. At Meta, obviously, you're at different points in the value chain for streaming, right? Like you have the apps and the infrastructure and like all different kinds of products, if you will. What's your perspective on now? Why now, the streaming wars and or the streaming licensing action, and where is it most unfolding?
Yeah, and I'd say this I think it's Clay mentioned, I think there has been litigation around streaming for quite some time. I think really kind of the new wrinkle that at least I'm seeing is kind of more litigation around streaming rights.
Right, on video.
Right, on video codecs around streaming. I think that's the new aspect that is happening. And I suspect it's probably just kind of has sometimes timing, right? Kind of finding the right timing when you decide that you ultimately want to use or use those assets to somehow generate value. I mean, most of these assets were there, right? They were kind of there. They were in the background, but I think when you have less success with PTAP, I think you have some jurisdictions in which it is somewhat easier to get an injunction than it was historically. Also just kind of realize, it's a good time to actually go and use some of those assets now that you kind of had in the holster before and decided not to use. I think to John's point, and I think it's a really good one. I think Clay mentioned kind of market value, and John spent some time talking about value. I think one of the reasons why you end up sometimes getting to the point associated with litigation is you've just kind of disparate values that are kind of all over the place, and it's hard to really kind of round in on, okay, what is the right? Who has actually come out with a solution that's really tighter to that market-based value, and you have some companies that just ultimately say, hey, maybe litigation is just a better way to ultimately figure out what that true value is, right? What that price is that we should pay for. For me, I have to counsel business executives on what some of these costs are associated with, using streaming on our devices. And if they come to me and they say, oh, hey, we see this entity has one rate, this other entity has another rate, which one is correct? I don't know. But, you've got multiple disparate rates. Obviously, we'll bring in our own economists. We'll do our own evaluation of that value. We'll ultimately look at the value of certain codecs to our streaming business and the services that we provide for our customers. But I think for us, we sometimes kind of need to be in a position where we could really kind of ground that value on something. And, you know, as you would probably imagine, when we do our own kind of internal investigation, and we bring in our economists and we look at the value, we compare it to some of the values that are put out there, you know, it's a little bit lower, right? It may not directly align. So it's really trying to find out.
Okay, now we're getting into juicy territory.
No, but it's.
Let's talk about value and, you know, where the differences lie, and I think that's where the differences lie. So first, I think you rightly pointed out that we're talking about streaming related licensing disputes, but this is more about the video codecs and standards video IP, which is newer. And now for the video coding technologies, as I think most of the people in the room know, but if you don't, it's important to clarify that we'll talk a little bit in this panel about the distinction from smartphone and cellular world to the world of streaming and video codecs. Actually, we'll talk a lot about that. And one of the differences is that when it comes to streaming, right, there is encoding and there is decoding, right? So there is one part of the function that is done on the devices, and there is one part of the function that is on the infrastructure. So now we have multiple levels of licensing. And my question to you, John, is we're moving from device-level licensing to multi-level licensing, or maybe use-based licensing. You tell us, why is it necessary from a licensing perspective to move to this paradigm, and how is that different from what was happening in the smartphone era?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think of it a little less like usage-based licensing. You know, so our device program typically covers the decoders in devices and software. That's historically the way things have been done, and it probably came out of the telecommunications networks, because if you had companies that were developing equipment, their customers would potentially be the infringers, right? And they don't want to necessarily sue your customers. So the idea was to look at the end user device as the licensable thing.
And the industry reached an equilibrium to license at the device level over time.
Right, I think that became accepted. I mean, there's still conversations that we have where companies would prefer to push it down to the chip level, but I think licensing it at the end product level as opposed to the chip has become accepted. But when it comes to streaming, our program specifically excludes the processing and transmission of encoded content. So we historically didn't license anything that went into the network. But what we're seeing is a lot of the value is sort of at that level, right? And a lot of 80%, 85% of internet traffic is video. So if that's the case, being able to compress it at high fidelity with low bandwidth, there's a lot of value to that. And so I think what the feeling by the market was it was maybe no longer reasonable to ask the end user device companies to bear all of the royalty load. And there really ought to be a sharing of the value of the codec as between end users and consumers, and those that are getting a lot of value out of the network.
I don't think Gil is trying to say something.
And so I do want to get back to the usage-based question, because I don't think we've never really licensed based on use, but if you look at the pool, again, we did a listening tour. One of the things that we heard is for streaming companies or companies that have a streaming model, it's difficult to count things. Or there are reasons why you don't want to count things because of privacy reasons and things around the world. And so if you can come up with something that avoids that issue, whether you're counting users or subscribers, what they really didn't want to do was say the royalty associated with an individual user is 1 penny per month. So we try to avoid that with a tiered structure that basically says, within this band, the royalty is this amount, and you don't actually have to tell us or even agree that the royalty for a user is a penny a month or a tenth of a penny a month. Again, that was completely market responsive to what we heard from companies when we were designing the program, and so that's why we built it that way. But it's not. I don't think it's based on usage, other than if you got users that aren't having access to the 4 codecs in the pool, that they aren't necessarily counted, or they can be excluded if they're not. They don't have access to the codecs.
Yeah, and John or Clay, which one of you want to go next? Because I think this is an important question, right? What should be the level of licensing? What's the right unit? And what makes sense from a marketing perspective?
Sure, so I think that's, again, a question that needs to kind of be very deliberately and thoughtfully answered. Rushing into it and porting the model that was used for mobile devices, which is based on devices sold, and trying to look at subscribers, I think, leaves open a very strong possibility of overestimating the value of the codec. If you try to anchor it to more objective factors like CDN usage, other things that can kind of be tethered, and look at the features, UHD, HDR, that are unlocked when you have a more powerful delivery vehicle, I think that helps better frame the conversation. If you look purely at subscribers, I think you run the risk of including, either intentionally or unintentionally, the product, the content itself. What makes Disney Plus popular? Is it the content? Is it the IP, the soft IP, or is it the patented features related to video delivery?
Do you have any thoughts on that, Ray? Do you agree? How would you think about licensing? Should it be subscriber-based or device level like it used to be in the cellular world, or does it necessarily need to be different?
Kind of take it from a different approach from the beginning, and where that ends could be the same or could be different depending on where that analysis ends. But let me just take a step back. When you said we're talking about specifically encoding or coding patents now.
Encoding and decoding.
Encoding and decoding patents, and not sort of other patents. Which I think brings us sort of a little bit to the real world on the value, but when you take it even more of a step to the real world, only twice in my entire career have I had a licensee say they only wanted a specific patent or a specific set of patents. What the business people at licensees usually want is, I want to pay you once for whatever I need for what I'm doing, whether that's SEPs, NSEPs, implementation, whatever it is, it just comes down to the value of it. So that's one piece. As far as the second question, or the actual question you're asking, excuse me, I separate value and metric. We have a value that we believe our innovation has brought to a particular industry, a particular market, a particular licensee. And there's a level of that value. And invariably there are fights over that value, as Shane put it, and I think John alluded to. And we try to get close to that value. What most licensors typically do when they have flexibility on metric, or they don't sort of have a standardized metric from the beginning, is they have flexibility on that metric. We've, a lot of the times in the streaming space, per subscriber is the metrics used because licensors like to match the growth of and health of their licensee, of their customer, to the growth and the health of the amount that they pay. You don't want them paying us more when their business is going down and their executives are saying, why is our business failing? And when it's going up, conversely, you don't want our revenue to go down. So we try to match whatever the value is, we try to denominate that in a metric that's a metric that the licensee is already tracking and is using to measure the health and growth of their business. And that's why per subscriber or per MAU comes out in the streaming or the social spaces.
So, I mean, look, fundamentally what you're all saying is it's a question of the value, determining the value, and this is fundamentally an economic question. And to me, frankly, something that we can try to empirically answer truthfully. So, you just talked about the subscriber base, and like in the cellular world, for example, right? Like when the standards go from 3G to 4G and 4G to 5G, there is a way to determine with many methodologies that the economics toolkit used to understand what is a consumer surplus, like what is it that consumers are gaining to shift to 4G or move to 4G instead of 3G or move to 5G instead of 4G. What is the value that they're deriving from the latest generation of technology that they're using? And I think that the same question has to be applied to this technology, right? Like video encoding and decoding. What is the actual value? And I wonder, and this is a question for the whole room, if there is a different mix of subscriber base. Like I know that I'm somebody and I'll out myself who has a 12-year-old television set, so I don't really care about the quality of the video stream that much. But I know that there are many others who are savvy users who really care, right? And they want to use the most recent 4K or 8K or whatever it is, but there is a heterogeneity, as we call it in account. There's a variance of the kinds of subscribers that there are. So to me, that's a question you can actually answer with data and with observations. So has the industry tried to sort that out in licensing programs? And I think it's a question for all of you. Maybe we can start with John and go around.
Yeah, I mean, one of the data points I think that we considered is that when you look at the pricing structure for paid subscription services, typically the higher the resolution, the higher the subscription price. And you know, that sometimes there's, you know, it's subsidized by ad support, but we use that as sort of a key. There's value there if you're willing to charge more, $4 or $5 a month, whatever it is, for the higher level of resolution, then the consumers must appreciate or perceive some sort of value there. And as TVs get bigger, the higher resolution tends to matter more. And so that was a data point. I mean, I want to go back to one other piece just to reiterate it, and maybe say it for the first time. When it comes to sort of sharing the value as between the content providers and the devices, when we designed the program, it was really meant to approximate sort of a 50-50 split in terms of what the royalties would be, rather than, for example, trying to drive device royalties downward at the expense of content royalties upwards. We didn't think that that was the right approach. And we really did try to take a sort of a sharing approach, sharing the value, you know, again, as between the end devices and the network. And you know, another thing I guess I think about when I think about the telecom industry, I think about long-term contracts, which is something that for content is different, right? One of the things that we realize there's a lot of concern about is churn, right? If you have a month-to-month subscription, it's easy to cancel. I don't know if that's necessarily true once you've made the purchase of a phone or your cell phone plan. And historically, phones have been dumb devices and all the intelligence was in the network. I think now that's shifted, right? There's a lot more intelligence on the terminal device, and the network is really more of like, can it carry, and you know, can it deliver whatever content I need, or whatever phone, voice, video, whatever, with less loss. So, you know, there's a long way of saying there's a lot of things that we sort of considered and compared and contrasted when it came to how we derive the rates. And we also have a white paper that we published on our website that tries to take kind of a rigorous economic analysis. You're sort of looking at the costs, the benefits, the surplus, and how is the surplus split. And we use the device pool and the surplus split in the device pool, again, sort of as a guiding point for what's an acceptable split as between implementers and patent holders. And ultimately, you know, again, as a market-based solution, if a patent pool is successful, it will attract licensors and licensees, and that's obviously what we're driving at. You know, our CEO was on a panel the other day, and he said, let's not forget that licensees actually have a very active role in driving this forward as well. If you see something that you think is a pool that you could potentially get behind, joining it as a licensee will probably also inspire licensors to consider putting their patents in the pool, which raises the value proposition for everybody. And if you're in a bilateral discussion, having a pool license whose value on a per patent basis increases over time with no attendant increased rates, that could be an important counterpoint as well. We heard a little bit about that on the panel.
So you have customers on both sides on this panel. So let me ask, both of them what they would like to see from pools, and would you ultimately see a convergence to a single pool? Let me ask John and Shane, you first. Do you think that these methodologies that are being used for valuation and the right level of licensing are serving the concerns that you all have raised?
Sure, I think, again, there is an absolute benefit to having a blanket rate that applies to the whole industry. My concern is everything is happening so quickly, and I don't think we can exclude from this discussion the kind of legal landscape, because with foreign injunctions being posed, it gives the tendency, but at least the ability, to extract far more value, targeting the value of the service entirely, as opposed to something limited to the value of the patent portfolio itself. And if you look at other industries that have been licensed, they progressed over years, right? They had time to say the advancements from 2G to 3G are extremely valuable. The advancements from 3G to 4G are extremely valuable, but subsequent advancements, less valuable. They had abilities for both sides to speak and get guidance from federal courts in the US about should you look at the entire value of the product or if you should look at the value of a chip. And all of that discussion now is out the window with foreign cases, some of which can be moved as quickly as a few months, some of which move as quickly as a year. But those decisions and those negotiations are not happening in real time anymore. They're happening with the threat of litigation. And I think the real problem is, if we were to arrive at a value that everybody, licensors and licensees would agree on, of course, that would be wonderful. And I think we have empirical data to your earlier question. I do think we have empirical data that can help us arrive at that value. What will happen, however, is if people are pricing based off of the conjunctive threat as opposed to the value of the patent or the value a larger group sets, they are necessarily going to extract higher amounts. And in aggregate, that could absolutely undermine the viability of the standard as a whole.
So let's talk a little bit about the disputes in the courts, and we won't talk about specific cases because there are live cases going on right now, including companies that are on this panel. So we'll keep this abstracted, but my question is this, right? If this is happening in the courts, and the question that you just raised, John, is what is the split between the value that the streaming service is providing to the consumer versus the value the coding technology is providing to the consumer? Again, an empirically observable answer, empirically answerable question, just like it was in the world of cellular, right? You can identify that value, and you can also identify, from when you move from generation to generation, is there a sort of a concave function, like a diminishing returns to the efficiency that is being gained when we move to more and more advanced generations or not, or there are step function changes. Either way, these questions can be answered, and are the courts not addressing those with the right experts in the room as they're trying to figure out the split in value?
Well, I think you have to balance that with the injunction risk and how quickly some of these cases move forward as well, right? And I do agree, I think we can kind of meet this kind of economic analysis of the benefit of specific codecs or generations to codecs to others, but I think the difficulty is you just have pressing litigation that's going on at the same exact time, and you have companies that are weighing market-based solutions at the same time as you're trying to kind of consider this economic value. So I think the difficulty is just the timing and how quickly these cases move, or at least that's the way I see it.
What do you have to say to that, Ray and John?
A fair amount, actually.
I'm ready to go.
I mean, I guess sort of the first thing, you mentioned the NPLA pool as one pool, and now there's a multiple. Neither one of them solve the ultimate issue, which is potential fragmentation. NPLA
Right.
can include all licensors, so if you think of it as a one-stop shop, it ignores the overall reality of that. As to your question of value, there's a difference between can it be answered and can we answer it. It can theoretically be answered, but there's an asymmetry of information in a licensing context, in a negotiating context, and I think sometimes when you go to a court or a tribunal, they are trying to examine that. As far as the speed with which this litigation moves, I mean, there's a whole discussion we could have on why there's now global litigation as opposed to
Which we
specific
started the day with,
ones,
right?
which we did a fair amount the other day. But when you think about, oh, this is moving fast, this is moving quickly, and everything, you said Disney Plus launched in 2019. It was one of the later services. I think Paramount Plus was the last one that actually of large libraries that created its own service. But ESPN3 and ESPN Plus launched a lot before, and you actually had Disney Go and other stuff launching before 2010. So, 17, 18 years, I'm not so sure how much slower we could go in trying to license this industry as it's grown up. Like, I think.
And you might want to add that the patent's expired.
Well, I mean, if the patents expire, they expire, and become public domain, that's the case. But the case is we've always licensed, or at least I've always licensed video distribution. But video distribution has morphed from broadcast to cable satellite, IPTV, into the streaming, and what's happened is the studios and the content owners have now vertically integrated down into the distribution, which puts them into the technology phase, which is where we license. That's why we're seeing it now. But as far as speed, I guess it's in the eye of the beholder whether things move too quickly or too slowly, and it's very, very much a subjective call on that, I think.
Fair. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I was a litigator in a past life, and I think to some extent it provides a forcing function when people have a real stake. If you're negotiating against a well-resourced but strategically patient company, again, other than trying to be the nicest person you can and trying to paint the picture as clearly as you can, sometimes it's hard to get their attention. They probably have a lot of demands on their time. And litigation, which again, the pool doesn't, we don't break litigation, the licensors do, if they don't think that the pool is progressing quickly enough to a pool license. Sometimes they will rely on negotiation to discharge their brand obligation. So, there's a little bit of information sharing from that perspective, but the pool itself doesn't litigate. But when you talk about business predictability, you know that you're going to have a decision in 18 months or 6 months or 9 months, whatever the timeline is. I think it really forces some of the things that can happen in the negotiation, some of the bluffing, some of the sort of focus on tangential issues. It takes a lot of that stuff out of the equation. It really forces you to focus and drill down, I think maybe more efficiently on what really matters and what really a solution kind of will look like ultimately. And that's, as a deal maker, that's all I ever want to do is get to the end and get to a place where we're both, something that we can live with.
So thank you. Now, I want to bring the room into this conversation, if that's okay with all of you. And I think we've covered enough ground about why are we seeing licensing and litigation in streaming, why the level of licensing question is different for streaming, and we have arguments about where it should be subscriber-based, should be not subscriber-based, how one thinks about the split of value between the streaming content and the value that is provided by the video codec technology, and whether the question of this empirical question of value is something we have had enough time to hash out and answer inside or outside of the courtrooms yet. That said, there are similarities and differences from the smartphone era that all of this room has lived for the last 10 to 15 years and litigated through the courtrooms and continues to. So I would like to start with the question first to all of you and then to the room. What can we gather from the lessons learned and what we need to be careful about where we cannot borrow the lessons we have learned but have to think differently? John, let's start with you.
Sure. So I've invested more time looking at the past 30 years of licensing discussions in other industries than ever I imagined I would. But I think there are lots of lessons because I think a lot of the plays made from both sides are the same. You'll have patent owners who will try to extract to the absolute maximum value they possibly can, and you'll have implementers try to identify the value and to try to get the best deal they can. Without guidance from a court, and that is often up to the Wild West, and we have empirical data that we could rely on, but there's also a lot of differentiation in value assignment. I don't know what's going to happen because unlike other industries where U.S. courts and damages and potential recovery damages kind of set benchmarks, in the realm of injunctions, especially injunctions that are very, very quickly granted, you are changing the negotiating power dynamics dramatically, and you're going to have a binary result. You're either going to have a licensed industry or you're going to have a dead codec. And there's really no room in between, because if you're an implementer and you enter into licenses because of threats of injunctions and you enter into many licenses, the absolute worst case scenario would be for someone at the tail end of the licensing to say, my value has now quadrupled or gone up by a factor of 20 or 10 or 1,000. Would you rather not license and get enjoined and pay all these licenses that you're already entered into? Or would you rather pay this amount? And it's almost a game theory problem where everyone is acting in their absolute own self-interest and there is no larger pressure or guiding force. Everyone is trying to extract maximum value. The motivations will effectively eviscerate the entire system, and I think that codec will die.
And that was the case in the cellular as well.
We've seen examples of that,
Yeah.
some of which may be directly related to the injunctive threat, yes.
But that didn't happen, right?
There are certain 5G in automobiles, for example. It's not currently, to my knowledge, being offered. And they're again, especially since we're talking about marginal improvements in technology, you can see that some improvements are worthwhile, and some improvements, the customers, the consumers, or the licensees will say that's just not worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
And so that will lead to a hold on that technology until patents expire or different standards are released that drive down the price.
Go ahead, Kay. I mean, I find that to be quite similar to the smartphone issues, right? Like
I think
there are multiple licensors, and at any time, there is always a threat that some licensor comes around and says, hey, by the way, you need to pay me X as well, and hold a threat of injunction. But then the industry manages to sort it out, so how do we learn from that?
So I think John rightly pointed out, there are many similarities to the smartphone industry. But I think there's one fundamental difference between the two, and it's the essentiality of the patents and what the licensees or the implementers' choices are. If, especially on the device side and the decoding side, that last licensee that John's worried about can come in with a blocking patent and say, I may have one patent of 100,000, but if I get this injunction, you don't have the money to redesign the chip. You can no longer be standard essential. You're at in that instance, they may be able to charge, supra market rates, right? But we've seen in many instances on the encoding side, there are choices. The injunctions don't block somebody from doing from implementing a standard. They may block them from a feature of the standard. And in that case, there's a real choice with the implementer of the value of that feature, because they can still make an HEVC or AVC compliant stream. It just may not be as efficient. And there's a cost to re-encoding your entire library. There's a cost to the consumer. There may be a cost to your business. But economically, you can balance that against the cost of the license. And that provides us an economic ceiling on what that licensee can charge.
So you're saying there's more modularity in the portfolio, right? Like it's in the cellular world, you either take the whole entire cellular standard and implement it or not, but here you can kind of
And on the decoding side, when you're putting in hardware, you don't have a choice. You have to decode every feature that could possibly come in. That doesn't mean someone encoding a library has to implement any of those features. So they do have choices, which again, I think, and John may disagree, I think that tempers what that last licensee can get, unless they really do have a complete blocking patent, in which case you could argue they're not actually charging. That is the value. I have others to say on the global things, but I'll
Shane, you wanna?
Yeah, I think on that point, honestly, I was going to say something similar. I think you'll see companies ultimately decide which codecs they want to use and which ones that they don't, right? Because when you have certain companies that are in industries where you tell your engineers to innovate and use whatever codecs you want, there's may now be a cost associated with using certain codecs over other codecs, right, as well. So it's ultimately being able to map out what, if any, licensing costs there are associated with those specific codecs and providing that business with that flexibility associated with that. But also in that last licensee context, you still have at least a over understanding as to what you think that stack rate is.
Yeah,
to
I
give the
guess that's
business.
different from smartphone cellular world as well, because the entire world goes from 4G to 5G or not. You don't make that distinction, but with codecs, you have a choice. John?
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, designing a program that gives the business the flexibility to make their decision based on business considerations rather than, and by the way, whichever is the better codec for them or for their customers, rather than on a perception about how much it's going to cost in license, in royalty, patent royalties. One other point, just to kind of to address what John said about unpredictability and somebody coming at the end, a feature of pool licenses or our pool licenses is a limitation on the ability to increase rates at renewal time. So for existing licensees, they know the rates that they're paying, and they know at renewal time it'll be no more than 20% higher, if it's higher at all. So there is a cap on the amount that the royalty could go up. And so, if you're successful, if the pool is successful in attracting licensors and licensees, you certainly use the pool as a comp if somebody comes at the last minute and says, hey, the value of my one patent is 150x what you're paying now. I think that if you are a willing licensee and you've got a comparable through a pool, can point out that maybe the offer isn't FRAND, and you're demonstrated your willingness to take a FRAND license by virtue of being a pool licensee.
Thank you. And now to everybody, and I think some people in the room know that if you don't engage, I'm going to call on certain people, so just everybody be ready and on your toes. But I want to open the floor for any conversation with us, right? What do you think are the lessons that we can learn and things that we really need to carefully differentiate? Jim Harlan is my
Yeah.
go there. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, is this thing on? Yeah, okay. Jim Harlan, 25-year patent attorney, formerly colleague of Clay's up there. Now I'm doing my thing. So the question I have is, we've heard a lot of parallels between smartphone and video industries, and streaming and smartphone industries. But I always like to go back to the core IPR policies. And at SEP, we know that it defines essentiality as technically essential. ITU common patent policy talks about required to implement. It doesn't talk about technical versus commercial essentiality. And I don't think any court has mentioned it either. And I'm just kind of curious about the panel's view, because we know and we've heard that decoding is normative to the standard, and encoding is kind of more of an implementation style. So I'm just kind of curious on an issue that hasn't been decided by courts yet, specifically is required to implement, what the panel thinks about commercial versus technical essentiality, or if it's meant to be vague. Thanks.
Sure, so I think a lot of the patents themselves were dedicated as a group, regardless of decoding or encoding. But in terms of a practical essentiality, I'm going to use a different term. I do think let's look at HVDC, right? It is hundreds, if not thousands, of operations and advantages that are bundled together. Decoding needs to be able to process those operations. However, the advantage of HEVC over AVC is efficiency. That efficiency allows certain features to be unlocked, whether it's 4K, whether it's color related. If you begin to remove individually via design around or defeaturing those individual advantages, there's a practical efficiency where you're no longer going to be more efficient than AVC, and you're no longer going to be able to deliver those features like 4K, UHD or HDR. On the back end, these codecs, in addition to providing efficiency, one of the most important requirements is compatibility, right? Especially with legacy devices, older devices, security devices. 12-year-old televisions. We know ABC and HEVC are compatible. We don't know if newer equipment are compatible. It may be that they could be compatible, or it may be that they're simply incompatible. So I think there is a practical level of efficiency where, yes, it's possible to design around and de-feature to avoid 1 patent or 2 patents, but is it possible to remove advantages from 10 patents, 20 patents, 50 patents? At that point, when you're talking about a patent thicket of 30,000 patents, there's a very real possibility that too many design arounds will basically eliminate the entire reason that you're using this codec in the first place.
And what does it take to switch to another codec?
A lot of pain. A lot of pain and hope that it's compatible on the back end too.
So is compatibility an issue, or is it efficiency, is it performance, or is it mostly the switching cost?
Well, it's all of the above. You have to re-encode your entire library. You have to re-encode in a way that is compatible with hardware that's out there. HEVC and AVC obviously are kind of gold standard, right? We expect relatively 100% compatibility with devices. Anything short of that is a cost.
Can I do something different and instead of disagreeing with John, build on what he said? Look, you're raising a lot of very good concerns that we hear from lots of implementers, and I've heard over a long period of time. And what it ultimately comes down to is agreeing on the value so the technology can move forward and consumers can benefit from that. And obviously, not obviously, but usually I will take different views on where those features or those factors come out than someone in John's company, and potentially someone in Shane's company. But ultimately, we're trying to find that right value. And I think, going back to the very beginning, why are we in sort of a lot of litigation right now? I'm going to say something that anyone who's been practicing less than 20 years will find very, very strange. But back when, before eBay, before Lexmark, before the PTAB, before IPRs, before Alice, nobody wanted to go to litigation. Not the implementers, not the licensors, because it was instantly you go in and you're spending millions of dollars and there's no decisions coming out from courts for 2 to 3 years, and the first decision is at trial. And nobody wanted to go over that cliff on either side. And there was an incentive for everybody to avoid litigation. And I won't say much, 100%, but I considered it a failure for that entire part of my career if anything went to litigation. We had something like a 98% success rate in licensing.
Thank God I wasn't doing this.
So I would love to hear if anyone has a different viewpoint or thoughts on that. But for me, I have 2 parts of my career. One is sort of the pre-eBay and when there were sort of treble damages and other things going on, and there was incentive to settle. And then sort of the post where you almost had to go through litigation to get through the rough water, get out to open ocean where people would agree on valuation.
Yeah, maybe just to touch on Jim's question, I mean, from the patent pool perspective, what the license is actually directed to is what we call practice claims, which are claims that you're actually using the licensors, whether they're on our patent list, which we basically use as a way to divide royalties among the licensors on the back end. But if a licensor has a patent that you can't, I think it's necessarily and unavoidably using the practice of the standard, that would be de facto standard essential, whether or not it's on our list, whether or not it's been evaluated. So we try to provide a degree of certainty for some of the things that you're talking about there.
Yeah. I know there are more questions. Look, Julie, I was gonna say, I want to hear from an economist, because Julie is at Qualcomm now. She used to be at the FTC. She's an economist. And I wanted to say that this is a very rich ground for economic analysis that needs to be done. So we're all excited in the room, I mean, some of us.
Well, I might disappoint you a little bit because I want to steal a question that I heard Richard Berry ask at IPBC, which was really insightful for me to how to think about this space. And so I'd like to maybe paraphrase and put it to you all and get your perspective. And it was something along the following lines, right? Like, so back in the day, right? Some of us can remember, right? We used to go to the Blockbuster store or got our DVDs delivered in the mail. And licensing back then was at the device level, but also at the content level, but the content that was being licensed was the DVD itself. And now obviously technology has changed and evolved, and now the content is the streaming, right? And so, like, what, has anything really fundamentally changed, right? We're still looking at device level licensing, we're looking at content level licensing, but now the delivery format of the content is different, right? And so, is there really something new here, or is this really just more of the same?
I'll go first. And I don't know if you knew this when you asked the question, but I started licensing CDs and DVDs. So
It's a tailor-made question for
Here's
you.
what a softball
They're
looks
just
like.
standing.
And for some of you, CD is a compact disc where people used to go to a brick and mortar store and get them. It sort of harkens back to something I said earlier. We're not licensing the content. Right, we're licensing the delivery mechanism. The delivery mechanism, used to be cable satellite, used to be CD, DVD, used to be the PVRs or however. John said earlier that Disney's content has value. I mean, Disney can charge more for their
It's
Star
Disney.
Wars.
It's the Cinderella
For
story.
Star Wars than you can for cat videos. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that. And I don't think John's disagreeing that the delivery mechanism and the innovations that went into that, some of which Disney participated in, some of which they did not, that has value as well. What we're talking about is what's the level of value and the level of split between them. John harkened to it, and I'm sure Jim has an AI model that can figure out as well.
John, it has it.
But I don't think anything has changed if you look at it from, we're licensing the technology that is the carrier for the content. It's just a whole lot harder to unpack where that content technology split is. That's what
It's more complicated, right? Because you have to figure out the split and the versions, the different kinds of codecs. You've all informed us that there is a choice whether to upgrade to the next codec or not. I think John has something to say before.
I mean, but fundamentally, hasn't that always been what every dispute has been about? How to split the value? That's not new.
I mean, a lot of my job is not rocket science.
And I think a question for Clyde, I mean, if it's the distribution mechanism, I think what you have for implementers like Disney or us is, okay, why use multi-active subscribers or, multi-active users as the basis? Like, what should the proper basis be? And I think there's some confusion around that when we're kind of focusing on the distribution mechanism.
John?
We could have a one-on-one.
Anyway, go ahead.
No, so I had a couple of points. First, I agree. Like, the more we can talk about distribution and technology involved in distribution, improved efficiency, I think the more we're properly framing, from my perspective, the discussion and moving away from subscriber base, which I think is much more sensitive to content than it is distribution tools. I will say I've actually heard I don't know why, but I've heard the Blockbuster example quite a bit over the past week. And what I want to make clear is you're skipping several iterations of delivery. Right? We're not talking about going from Blockbuster to HEVC in 2026. We have a lot of technology and a lot of distribution ABC, you know, the prior HR 264 is probably the most relevant. You know, what was the world like when ABC patent licensing was discussed? And you know, that kind of addresses some of the distribution issues that Shane mentioned. And so how do we go from there to HEVC? And again, I do think that there are lessons to be learned, right? Cellular did this, Wi-Fi did this, with improved functionality, improved features from each generation. What are those features worth? And how can we learn from the prior generation, but how does that impact, you know, what we have today?
I think we have time for one more question.
I just want to sort of address one comment about subscribers versus users. And if you're not familiar with our pool, we actually have two different metrics, one for monthly active video users and one for monthly subscription video users. And roughly the way it breaks down is we treat a subscriber as equivalent to 10 monthly active video users, partly because the subscribers pay for the content, which I think probably helps offset the creation cost. And in both cases, I think, you know, from the content provider's side, they can use either MAUs or subscribers to sell ads on the other end, right? So they're recouping value in a different way, using a different business model. But we try to count it and account for the fact that there are different distribution models depending on whether you're a social media company, whether you consider yourself a movie studio or a content company. So we try to build that flexibility in, so that it wasn't a one size fits all. We don't treat a Facebook user or a Threads user as the same as a Disney Plus subscriber. There's flex in the way it is designed.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. I have my pick, so try to save that person, somebody, by asking a question.
Yeah.
Okay, John, John Cartman, I was going to ask you something. So you're safe because there's a question in the back.
So I really like when TV city has a 12 years old TV. I can't even afford TV. So my question is, is it fair that if I only have a phone and I pay the same licensing fee as a person who can afford a 100-inch TV? Because 4K on the phone doesn't really seem to be so much different than lower resolution. And then if everybody's paying the same price, am I actually subsidizing, or rather are you creating a situation that the poor are subsidizing the rich?
Okay, so different devices, same content, same delivery mechanism. Should the price be the same? Is it the same?
Depends on who you're talking to. No, and to your point, if you're using a phone, you're probably using ABC, with the exception of very few devices.
But you pay the same amount for Disney Plus subscription, whether you have a 12-year-old TV or a new TV or a phone.
And depending on where you are in the world as well.
Right.
But I guess I would take your question and I would say, personally, I would not distinguish between ABC and HEVC on a handheld device or even a small television. We are very quickly improving so much technologically that you're going to have 8K video codecs available. You're going to have new generations of video codecs available, where I actually believe the consumers will be much more price sensitive because they simply won't care about something that the human eye can't distinguish. So are we at that point yet? Reasonable minds can disagree, but I think in the future you will absolutely see a point where the video codecs become so powerful and devices are also so powerful they're able to decode anything that you throw at them. So you know, this is moving very quickly. I think in time there will be a resolution one way or the other.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is partly, I think I said earlier, like, we denominate our programs, or I denominate my programs on subscribers or MAUs as a matter of convenience, but ultimately it's the overall value and be flexible with whatever the particular licensee wants within some measure of reason. But I think what you said kind of supports the per subscriber model, right? If and I won't use a streaming example, but I'll use my gym membership, which I've been paying for 2 years and haven't been. If we were to license something to that gym membership for me as a user, they're getting the economic benefit of me as a user because I'm paying them the money, and arguably they're getting more than somebody who's in shape.
Sounds like my Disney concession.
Because they actually go and use and create costs for that. So I think that does support having a per subscriber model. But I don't know of any, other than pools that sort of publish the rates and are sort of fixed into a model once they start getting licensees. Most bilateral licensors have a lot of flexibility in how they denominate their rates with particular licensees.
I think we're just in time, right? I don't want us to be the ones standing between everybody and their lunch, so I want to thank all the panelists. And by the way, before I close, I wanted to raise this question to John because I was going to raise the following. If we were going to write an economics paper and think about, like you said, first principles, and how do you determine this question of the value and the value split between the content and the distribution and the efficiency of the distribution that is improving, how would you start building it up from ground zero? I know obviously as practitioners you've all thought about it, and as economists, like this is now our time to, we're obviously, many of us are thinking about this when it ultimately comes to litigation in the courts, but this is a broader question that is going to play out for some time in the industry and in the courtrooms. So it's food for thought for everybody. Let's close on that note. Thank you very much.